Hello everyone and welcome to Deep Dives. In today's video we're going to take a deeper look at the most disappointing part of No Man's Sky, the ship combat. If you play No Man's Sky long enough you eventually encounter ship-to-ship combat. It's easily the most frustrating part of the game, which is surprising considering this is a game about space exploration. One would think the ship combat would be satisfying, but it's not. After slogging your way through your first encounter, you'll probably wonder, why does this feel so awful? Why does it not feel like a proper dogfight? Is it just the flight mechanics? The poor ship maneuverability? Bad control scheme? Or is there something else at work here? Well, today, we're going to break it all down and discuss what is behind this awful ship combat and what might be done to fix it. To understand why the space combat in No Man's Sky is so bad, it helps to first understand what good space combat looks like, and to understand why it works the way it does. Dogfighting is at the core of all great space combat. George Lucas understood this when he created Star Wars, and director Richard Marquand showcased it when he shot the dogfighting sequences during the Battle of the Second Death Star in Return of the Jedi.
They're heading for the medical frigate. Pressure steady.
A decade later, LucasArts would capitalize on those films by releasing the first game in the X-Wing series. X-Wing would go on to spawn two sequels, X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, the first game that offered multiplayer, and X-Wing Alliance. Each game built upon the mechanics and the success of its predecessor. Without question, the dogfighting in the X-Wing trilogy remains the best implementation of space combat that I have ever played. There have been numerous space-oriented games since then, each promising compelling space combat, and yet, to this day, hardly any have managed to get the dogfighting right. Unfortunately, LucasArts stopped making the X-Wing games after X-Wing Alliance in 1999. It would take another 21 years before Motive Games, working under Electronic Arts, finally released a true spiritual successor to the X-Wing trilogy with Star Wars Squadrons. Having spent a bit of time with Squadrons, I can say that Motive did a great job recreating the classic Star Wars dogfighting experience of those earlier X-Wing titles. But why does it work? Why does the ship combat in Squadrons feel so much different and so much more satisfying than the ship combat in No Man's Sky? To understand why ship combat looks and feels the way it does in any game, we must first start with a few basic concepts. Vectors, turn radius.
Vector. It's a mathematical term, a quantity represented by an arrow with both direction and magnitude.
As our friend from Despicable Me reminds us, a vector is simply an object with a magnitude and a direction. In space combat, the object is the ship and the magnitude is its speed. As long as its speed is not zero, it will have a direction as well. A ship's magnitude can be negative, causing it to move backwards. The second consideration here is the ship's turn radius, which effectively defines how quickly it can turn around and change direction. The bigger the turn radius, the wider the turn, and the longer it takes to execute the maneuver. The important concept to grasp here is that when a ship is turning, it probably isn't firing its weapons at the player. Oftentimes, ships begin combat by facing off against each other in a game of chicken, but once the ships fly past each other, the maneuvering begins as each tries to gain a positional advantage on the other. Being able to get behind an enemy and trail them is the name of the game. But this only works if the dogfighting mechanics, if the vectors and turn radiuses, are implemented a certain way. When they're not, you get the mess that is No Man's Sky. This brings us to the first problem with the ship combat in No Man's Sky. The turn radiuses stink. Remember what we said earlier. A wider turn radius takes longer to execute, and when a ship is turning, it's probably not shooting its weapons at the player. This time spent not shooting is something I like to call downtime. In No Man's Sky, the ship combat is often a one versus many affair. The player is often forced to defend against multiple enemies at once. Unfortunately, the enemy ships basically have a turn radius of 0. allowing them to make quick 180-degree hairpin turns in the blink of an eye. This quick turnaround time effectively eliminates the downtime of the enemy weapons, allowing them to stream weapon fire at the player in a nearly non-stop fashion. If the player were facing only a single enemy craft, this would still be a problem, but not a deadly one. However, since most encounters involve multiple ships, this situation becomes much worse. The player is forced to spend all of their time being bombarded with a constant deluge of enemy fire that, to put it frankly, is not a lot of fun. But that's only one of the major problems with the space combat in No Man's Sky. The problem with a tight turn radius is that a ship spends too much time shooting weapons and not enough time flying and maneuvering. During the development of X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, LucasArts learned this lesson. They knew they wanted to add a multiplayer component to the game, something that the first X-Wing game didn't have, but right away they ran into a problem, where players were abusing tight and fast turn radiuses. There was, simply put, too much time spent shooting and dying and not enough flying and maneuvering. Their solution to this problem was twofold. First, they linked ship turn radius to ship speed. This meant that if a ship was going really fast, it would have to make a wide turn radius. And if players wanted to make a tighter turn, they had to manually back off the throttle and slow their ship down. Thus, whether a player was going fast or slow, making a 180-degree turn was still going to take some amount of time. The second part of their solution was perhaps the more important part of the equation. It involved making sure ships couldn't just sit in one place and spin around like the Death Blossom from the last Starfighter. So they created the rule that a ship had to be moving to make a turn. If the player slowed their engines to 0, their ship would be unable to turn or rotate. These two elements together, slowing velocity for tighter turns and enforcing forward momentum to enable turning, helped eliminate the problems with the overabundance of fast 180-degree hairpin turns and constant weapons fire. As a bonus, they also added a bit of risk versus reward. Slowing the engines and attempting to make a tighter turn might result in a faster overall change in direction, allowing the ship's guns to bear down on the enemy quicker, but the ship was potentially a much easier target to hit for everyone else. All in all, X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter solutions to the problems of turn radius and ship speed ended up providing a very satisfying dogfighting experience. Ships were always in motion and always making wider turns than the 180-degree hairpin turn. And this just so happens to be where No Man's Sky fails in the biggest, clearest way. Every enemy ship in No Man's Sky can turn on a dime. The poor dogfighting mechanics in No Man's Sky are made possible because of yet another key problem. Enemy ships don't have to play by the same rules as the player. This is something that is as old as video games themselves, dating all the way back to Tecmo Bowl and Super Tecmo Bowl, where the longer the season went on, the faster the defensive players moved, no matter how bad of a team they were on. At the beginning of the season, you could take a player like Bo Jackson or Marcus Allen and zoom out into the open field through the line of scrimmage and score a touchdown. But by the end of the season, no matter which crappy team you were playing against, you had to zig and zag over the whole entire field just to score a TD like that, because the defensive players could just magically catch up. Odd as it may seem, playership in No Man's Sky actually does have to obey certain flight rules similar to those developed for X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter. In order to make a tighter turn, the player has to pull back on the throttle and decelerate. Unfortunately, the enemy ships in No Man's Sky do not have to play by that rule. As stated earlier, the enemy ships in No Man's Sky can turn on a dime. They can literally turn 180 degrees in the opposite direction without the need for a turn radius at all. But if they were forced to play by the same rules as the player, then maybe, just maybe, things would start to feel a little better. What many players suggest in order to deal with the multiple enemies and poorly designed ship combat mechanics in No Man's Sky is to hold the S key on the PC. This reduces the player's thrust, decelerates, and if held long enough, can even make the ship move backwards. But doing this is like putting a band-aid on a severed arm. By reducing the ship's speed, the player more or less sits in one spot, spinning around like the Death Blossom, firing at enemy ships as they approach. And since the enemy ships are constantly moving, but only know how to spin around into a 180-degree hairpin turn and fly directly at the player, this works. Sort of. However, at that point, we've abandoned any semblance of dogfighting, and ship combat has effectively become asteroids. X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter laid the groundwork long ago for proper dogfighting mechanics in video games. Only two rules are really necessary. First, the AI-controlled ships and the player must follow the same set of rules. Even if the computer pilots aren't as smart or skilled as the player, they still have raw numbers on their side. Most encounters, as we said, pit the player against multiple enemies, and in that regard, the enemy ships are already at an advantage. But more importantly than that is the second rule. Hairpin turns need to be eliminated from the game, and turning must become a function of a ship's speed. In other words, ships must be accelerating in order to initiate a turn of any kind, and if they want to make a tighter turn, they need to slow their engines and reduce speed. And even then, a slow speed turn should result in some kind of turn radius, not a ridiculous 180-degree hairpin turn. These two changes alone would dramatically improve the ship combat in No Man's Sky. But wait, there's more. The AI pilots themselves could stand to be tweaked to take advantage of these rules and restrictions. As it stands, they all follow roughly the same routine. They opt for the quick 180-degree turn because that's the most efficient thing for them to do. They want to get back to firing their weapons at the player, which makes logical sense, so they choose the hairpin turn. However, if turn speed and turn radius were factors and were restrictions for them, then the AI could be tweaked to opt for flight patterns that more closely resemble actual dogfighting. They could be trying to spend their time getting behind enemy ships instead of just flying straight at them. I know this is possible because back in 2003, Egosoft released X2 The Threat, another game that suffered from the same exact problems as No Man's Sky. Enemy ships had tight turn radiuses and velocities that did not play well with those tight turn radiuses. I spent days combing through the files, manually adjusting the turn radius and max velocities of every single fighter in the game. And after hours and hours of testing, I ended up with a much better experience. It wasn't perfect because I couldn't reprogram the enemy ship AI, but it was a considerable improvement over the default settings the game came with. There's no doubt that the ship combat in No Man's Sky is abysmal, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be better. Improving it wouldn't take a colossal effort either. A few tweaks here and there would do wonders. Coupling turn radius to ship speed and ensuring the AI had to play by the same set of rules as the player would provide the greatest benefit for the smallest amount of effort. Throw in a few tweaks to the pilot AI, and before long it might look and feel like a real dogfight. Here's hoping that Hello Games is listening and opts to do something about it. They just released another huge update, and surprise, surprise, they didn't touch ship combat. They've shown themselves, however, to be a developer that actually does listen to player feedback, and we've seen them improve the game with every single update. So, it would stand to reason that they could improve the ship combat if they wanted to, if our voices are loud enough. It would be great if they could finally get around to improving it, because it's long past time it received some love and attention. As always, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, leave questions and comments down below, and please consider supporting my Patreon, which is listed in the description below. I'll see you next time, and until then, happy gaming, everyone.